Hey there, everybody. We are so close to the end. I can feel it. Feels like paper. So, we are on chapter 13, in which Calcifer is very active. Calcifer's orange eyes turned to Sophie. Do you need me to keep guard here still? He asked her. Or can you manage with just the two of you? Sophie gazed worriedly out at the well-dressed, chattering crowd. I don't think anyone's going to try anything just now, she said. But come back quickly. I have a horrible foreboding feeling. I don't trust that mauve-eyed fellow to an inch, nor that nasty prince either. All right. Quick it is, Calcifer crackled. Stand up, young Charming. I'm going to sit on your hands. Charmaine got to her feet, expecting to be burned or at least singed at any moment. Morgan objected to her going by waving a yellow brick at her and raising a booming shout of, Gain, gain, gain! Shh, Sophie and Twinkle said together, and the fat nursemaid added, Master Morgan, we don't shout, not here in front of the king. It's yellow, Charmaine said, waiting for all the staring faces to turn away. She was beginning to see that none of the fine guests knew that Calcifer was part of the fire, and that Calcifer wanted to keep it that way. As soon as everyone lost interest and turned back to their chatter, Calcifer hopped up out of the fire and landed just slightly above Charmaine's nervous fingers in the exact likeness of a plate of cake. He did not hurt a bit. In fact, Charmaine could scarcely feel him. Clever, she said. Pretend to hold me, Calcifer replied, and walk out of the room with me. Charmaine curled her fingers round the false plate and walked towards the door. Prince Ludovic, to her relief, had moved away, but the king was coming towards her instead. He nodded and smiled at Charmaine. Got yourself some cake, I see, he said. Good, isn't it? Wish I knew why we have all of these rocking horses. You don't happen to know, do you? Charmaine shook her head, and the king turned away, still smiling. Why do we, Charmaine asked, have all of these rocking horses? Protection, said the plate of cake. Open the door, and let's get out of here. Charmaine took one hand out of the false plate, out from the false plate, opened the door, and slipped out into the damp, echoing hallway. But who's being protected from what? She asked, closing the door as quietly as possible. Morgan, said the plate of cake. Sophie got an anonymous note this morning. It said, Stop your investigation and leave High Norland, or your child suffers. But we can't leave because Sophie's promised the princess that she'll stay until we find out where all the money's gone. Tomorrow we're going to pretend to go. Calcifer was interrupted by shrill barking. Waif came dashing around the corner and hurled herself delightedly onto Charmaine's ankles. What do you think, knife butt? Calcifer jumped and floated free in his own shape as a fiery blue teardrop hovering by Charmaine's shoulder. Charmaine scooped Waif up. How did you... she began, trying to keep her face out of the way of Waif's eager tongue. Then she realized that Waif was not in the least bit wet. Oh, Calcifer, she must have come the quick way through the house. Can you find me the conference room? I can get us back from there. Easy. Calcifer darted off like a blue comet, so fast that Charmaine had trouble keeping up. He whirled round several corners and into the corridor where the kitchen smells were. In next to no time, Charmaine was standing with her back to the door of the conference room, with Waif in her arms and Calcifer floating by her shoulder, while she tried to remember just what you did from here. Calcifer said, It's like this, and zigzagged away in front of her. Charmaine followed as best she could, and found herself in the corridor where the bedrooms were. Sunlight was blazing in the window beyond Great Uncle William's study. Peter came dashing towards them, looking pale and urgent. Oh, good dog, Waif, he said. I've sent her to fetch you. Just come and take a look at this. He turned and galloped back to the other end of the corridor, where he pointed, rather shakily, at the view out of the window. Out in the mountain meadow, the rain was just passing away in big, melting, dark gray clouds that were obviously still raining below the town. A rainbow arched across the mountains, lurid in front of the clouds, and pale and misty across the meadow. The meadow grass blazed and twinkled with sunlit wetness, that Charmaine was dazzled for a moment and could not see what Peter was pointing at. That's the Lubbock, Peter said, rather hoarsely. Right? The Lubbock was there, towering huge and purple in the middle of the meadow. It was bending slightly to listen to a kobold, who was hopping up and down, pointing at the rainbow and evidently shouting at the Lubbock. "That's the Lubbock, all right," Charmaine said, shivering. "And that's Rollo." As she said it, the Lubbock laughed and rolled its bundles of insect eyes towards the rainbow. It stepped carefully backwards until the misty rainbow stripes seemed to be right beside its insect feet. There it bent and dragged a small earthenware pot out of the turf. Rollo capered about. "That must be the crock of gold at the end of the rainbow," Peter said wonderingly. They watched the Lubbock pass the pot to Rollo, who took it in both arms. It was evidently heavy. Rollo stopped capering and staggered about with his head thrown back in greedy joy. He turned to stagger away. He did not see the Lubbock slyly extend his long purple proboscis behind him. He did not seem to notice when the proboscis stabbed him in the back. He just sank away into the meadow's grass, still clutching the pot and laughing. The Lubbock laughed too, standing in the middle of the meadow and waving its insect arms. "It's just laid its eggs in Rollo," Charmaine whispered, "and he didn't even notice." She felt ill. The same thing had so nearly happened to her. Peter looked quite green and Waif was shivering. "You know," she said, "I think the Lubbock may have promised Rollo a crock of gold for making trouble between the kobolds and Great Uncle William." "I'm sure it did," Peter said. "Before you got here, I could hear Rollo yelling that he needed to be paid." He opened the window to listen. Charmaine thought, "The silly fool." "I have to declare war," Calcifer said. "I have to declare war," Calcifer said. He had gone rather wispy and pale. He added in a small hiss that trembled slightly, "I have to fight that Lubbock, or I won't deserve the life that Sophie gave me. One moment." He stopped speaking and hung in the air, long and stiff, with his orange eyes closed. "Are you the fire demon?" Peter asked. "I've never seen one before."
"Quiet," said Calcifer. "I'm concentrating. This has to be right."
There was a slight rumbling from somewhere. Then, overhead and across the window from behind, came what Charmaine at first took to be a thundercloud. It threw a large, black, turreted shadow over the meadow, which very quickly reached the rejoicing Lubbock. The Lubbock looked around as the shadow fell across it and froze for an instant. Then it started to turn. By this time, the turreted shadow had been followed by the castle that was making it. A tall black castle built of huge blocks of dark stone with turrets on all four corners. They could see the big stones it was made of shaking and grinding together as it moved. It came after the Lubbock faster than the Lubbock could run. The Lubbock dodged. The castle swerved after it. The Lubbock spread its small fuzzy wings for more speed and went bounding in furious strides to the tall rocks at the end of the meadow. As soon as it reached the rocks, it turned round and came rushing the other way towards the window. It must have hoped that the castle would crash into the rocks, but the castle reversed itself with no trouble at all. No trouble at all. And came after it faster than ever. "Yes, dear. Do you need to sit out on the balcony? Are you so desperate to look down on your adoring fans?" "Okay, fine." Oh, go ahead. I love you. What are you doing? Well, it's not bedtime yet. I haven't finished bedtime story. Dogs. No sense of... Well, most times. Excuse me. It must have hoped that the castle would crash into the rocks, but the castle reversed itself with no trouble at all and came after it faster than ever. Big puffs of black smoke went belching from the castle's turrets and floating away across the fading rainbow. The Lubbock swiveled one of its multiple eyes as it ran, then put its insect head down and pelted, feelers flapping, wings beating in a big curve that took it along the very edge of the cliff. Although its wings were now purple blurs, it seemed not to be able to fly with them at all. Charmaine understood why it had not tried to follow her down the cliff. It would not have been able to fly back up. Instead of jumping off the cliff to escape, the Lubbock simply kept on running, tempting the castle to follow and fall off the edge. The castle did follow. It came steaming and puffing and grinding its speed along the cliff, and seemed perfectly balanced in spite of the way that half of it was hanging over the edge. The Lubbock gave out a despairing hoot, changed direction again, and rushed out into the center of the meadow. There it played its last trick and went small. It shrank into a tiny purple insect and plunged in among the grass and flowers. The castle was on that spot in an instant. It shuddered to a stop over the place where the Lubbock had vanished and floated there. Flames began to come out of its flat underside, yellow flames first, then orange, angry red, and finally a white hotness that was too bright to look at. Flames and thick smoke licked up its sides and joined the dark smoke streaming from its turrets. The meadow filled with hot black fog. For what seemed hours but was probably only minutes, the castle was a dim, hovering shape over smoky brightness, like the sun seen through clouds. They could hear the roar of burning even behind the magical window. Right, Calcifer said. I think that's done it. He turned to Charmaine and noticed that his eyes were now of strange shining silver. And she noticed that his eyes were now strange shining silver. Will you open the window, please? I have to go and make sure. As Charmaine turned the catch and swung the window open, the castle rose up and moved sideways. All the smokes and fogs collected into one large, dark puff, which rolled across the edge of the cliff and out into the valley, where it shredded away to nothing. When Calcifer floated forward into the meadow, the castle was standing demurely with only a wisp of smoke coming from each turret, beside a big square patch of black earth. A perfectly horrible smell rolled in through the window. Oh, what is that? Roast Lubbock, I hope, Peter said. They watched Calcifer float to the burned square. There he became a blue streak of action, whirling this way and that across the blackness until he had covered every tiny scrap of it. He came floating back with eyes a normal orange again. That's it, he said cheerfully. Gone. So were a lot of flowers, Charmaine thought, but it did not seem polite to say so. The important thing was that the Lubbock was gone, and truly gone. The flowers will grow again next year, Calcifer said to her. What did you come and fetch me for? This Lubbock? No, the Lubbock eggs, Peter and Charmaine said together. They explained about the elf and what the elf had said. Show me, said Calcifer. They went to the kitchen, all except Waif, who whined and refused to go in there. There Charmaine had a fine, sunlit view of the yard out the window, full of dripping pink, white, and red laundry still on the clotheslines. Peter had obviously not bothered to fetch it in. She wondered what he had been doing. The glass box was still on the table, still with the eggs in it, but it had sunk into the table somehow, so that only half of it was showing. What made it do that? Charmaine asked. The magic in the eggs? Peter looked a little self-conscious. Not exactly, he said. That happened when I put my safety spell on. I was going back to the study to look up another spell when I saw Rollo talking to the Lubbock. Isn't that typical, Charmaine thought. This fool always thinks he knows best. The elf spells would have been quite enough, Calcifer said, floating above the embedded glass box. But he said it was dangerous, Peter protested. You've made it more dangerous, Calcifer said. Don't either of you come any nearer. No one can touch the box now. Does one of you know of a good stout layer of rock where I can go and destroy these eggs? Peter tried not to look chastened. Charmaine remembered her fall from the cliff, and how she had nearly landed on big rocks before she started to fly. She did her best to describe to Calcifer where those crags were. Under the cliff. I see, Calcifer said. One of you open up the back door, please, and then stand back. Peter hurried to open the door. Charmaine could see that he was quite ashamed of what he had done to the glass box, but it won't stop him doing something just as silly another time, she thought. I wish he'd learn. Calcifer hovered over the glass box for a moment, and then whirled to the open door. Halfway through the doorway, he seemed to stick, jerking and trembling until he gave a mighty heave, doubling himself up like a large blue tadpole, and then slamming himself straight again and shot forwards across the colorful washing. The glass box came loose with a scrape and a sound like someone throwing wooden planks about, and shot after him. It floated over the yard, eggs and all, following Calcifer's small blue teardrop shape. Peter and Charmaine went to the door and watched the glass box glinting its way up across the green hillside towards the Lubbock's meadow until it was out of sight. Oh, Charmaine said, I forgot to tell him that Prince Ludovic is Lubbocan. Is he? Really? Peter said as he shut the door. That must explain why my mother left this country then.
Charmaine had never had much interest in Peter's mother. She turned impatiently away and saw that the table was now flat again. That was a relief. She'd been wondering what you did with a table that had a square trench in the middle of it. What safety spell did you use? She said. I'll show you, Peter said. I want to have another sight of that castle anyway. Do you think we dare open the window and climb out near to it? No, said Charmaine. But the Lubbock's definitely dead, Peter said. There can't be any harm in it. Charmaine had a very strong feeling that Peter was asking for trouble. How do you know there was only one Lubbock? She said. The encyclopedia said, Peter argued, Lubbocks are solitary. Arguing fiercely about it, they wrangled their way through the inner door and turned left into the corridor. There Peter made a defiant dash for the window. Charmaine dashed after him and held him back by his jacket. Waif dashed after them, squeaking with distress, and contrived to tangle herself with Peter's feet so that he fell forwards with both hands on the window. Charmaine looked nervously out at the meadow, gleaming peacefully in orange sunset light, where the castle was still squatting beside the burned black patch. It was one of the queerest buildings that she'd ever seen. There was a flash of light so bright that it blinded them. Instants later, there came a clap of an explosion as loud as the light was bright. The floor beneath them jiggled and the window blurred in its frame. Everything shook. Through tears of dazzle mixed with blots of blindness, Charmaine thought she saw the castle vibrating all over. With ears fuzzy and deaf, she thought she heard rocks crash and grind and tumble. Clever waif, she thought. If Peter had been outside, he might be dead by now. What do you think that was? Peter asked when they could both almost hear again. Calcifer destroying the Lubbock eggs, of course, said Charmaine. The rocks he went to are straight under the meadow. They both blinked and blinked, trying to clear away blobs of blue and gray and yellow dazzle that would keep floating inside their eyes. They both peered and peered. It was hard to believe it, but nearly half the meadow was now missing. A curved piece like a huge bite had gone from the sloping green space. Below that, there must have been quite a landslide. Said Peter. You don't think he destroyed himself as well, do you? I hope not. They waited and watched. Sounds came back to their ears almost as a usual part of the little fizzing. Almost as usual, apart from the little fizzing. Mom. The blots gradually faded from their eyes. After a while, they both noticed that the castle was drifting in a sad, lost way across the meadow towards the rocks at the other end. They waited and watched until it drifted up over the rocks and out of sight along the mountainside, and there was still no sign of Calcifer. He probably came back to the kitchen, Peter suggested. They went back there. They opened the back door and peered out among the laundry, but there was no sign anywhere of a floating blue teardrop shape. They went through the living room and opened the front door, but the only blue out there was the hydrangeas. Do fire demons die? Peter said. I have no idea, Charmaine said. As always, in times of trouble, she knew what she wanted to do. I'm going to read a book, she said. She sat on the nearest sofa, pulled her glasses up, and picked The Magician's Journey up off the floor. Peter gave an angry sigh and went away. But it was no good. Charmaine could not concentrate. She kept thinking of Sophie and of Morgan, too. It was quite plain to her that Sophie was, in some strange way, that Calcifer was, in some strange way, part of Sophie's family. It would be even worse than losing you, she said to Waif, who had come to sit on her shoes. She wondered if she should go to the royal mansion and tell Sophie what had happened. But it was dark now. Sophie was probably having to have formal supper sitting opposite the Lubbocken prince with candles and things. Charmaine did not think that she dared interrupt another occasion in the mansion. Besides, Sophie was worried sick about the threat to Morgan. Charmaine did not want to worry her more, and perhaps Calcifer would turn up in the morning. He was made of fire, after all. On the other hand, that explosion was enough to blow anything to bits, Charmaine thought. Charmaine thought of a blue flame scattered about inside a landslide. Peter came back into the living room. I know what we ought to do, he said. Yes, Charmaine said eagerly. We ought to go and tell the kobolds about Rollo, Peter said. Charmaine stared. She took her glasses off and stared more clearly. What have the kobolds got to do with Calcifer? Nothing, Peter said, rather puzzled. Well, we can prove that the Lubbock paid Rollo to make trouble. Charmaine wondered whether to spring up and hit him around the head with the magician's journey. Bother the kobolds! We ought to go now, Peter began persuasively. Before... In the morning, Charmaine said, firmly and definitively. In the morning, after we've been up to those rocks to see what happened to Calcifer. But, said Peter, because, Charmaine said, quickly thinking of reasons, Rollo's going to be off somewhere hiding his crock of gold. He ought to be there when you accuse him. To her surprise, Peter thought about this and agreed with her. We ought to tidy up Wizard Norland's bedroom, he said, in case they bring him back tomorrow. You go and do that, Charmaine said. Before I throw my book at you, she thought, and probably the vase of flowers after that. So, chapter 14. So if we read that, we will have 2 chapters left, which means that we should be done with this book tomorrow night. Won't that be lovely? Charmaine was thinking of Calcifer when she got up the next morning. As she came out of the bathroom, she saw that Peter was busily engaged in changing the sheets of Great Uncle William's bed and stuffing the old sheets into a laundry bag. Charmaine sighed. More work. Still, she said to Waif as she put down the usual bowl of dog food, it keeps him busy and happy while I look for Calcifer. Now are you coming up to those rocks with me? Waif, as always, was only too pleased to go wherever Charmaine went. After breakfast she trotted eagerly after Charmaine through the living room to the front door, but they never went to the rocks. As Charmaine put out her hand to the doorknob, Waif charged out from behind her and burst the door open, and there was Rollo on the doorstep in the act of reaching his small blue hand out for the daily crock of milk. Uttering tiny snarls, Waif sprang upon him, got her jaws round Rollo's neck, and pinned him to the ground. Peter! Charmaine roared, standing in a pool of spilled milk. Come quickly! We need a bag! She put one foot on Rollo to keep him in place. Bag! Bag! She screamed. Rollo kicked madly and bounced around under her shoe, while Waif let go of him in order to bark. Fierce bark! Bark! Rollo added to the din by yelling, Help! Murder! Assault! In strong, grating howl. Peter, to do him justice, arrived at a run. He took one look at the scene in the doorway and snatched up one of Mrs. Baker's embroidered food bags, which he managed to get over Rollo's flailing legs, before Charmaine could draw breath to explain. Next second, Peter had the bag entirely over Rollo and was holding it up, bulging, twisting, and dripping milk, while he tried to reach one of his own pockets. Nice work, he said. Get some string out of that pocket, will you? We don't want him getting away. And when Charmaine had fumbled out a length of purple string from the pocket, he added, You had breakfast? Good. Tie the top of the bag really tight, then take it and hold it fast while I get ready. Then we can go straight there. Muttered the bag as Peter passed it over. Shut up, Charmaine said to it, and hung onto the bag with both hands just above the purple string. The bag twisted this way and that, while Charmaine watched Peter drag loops of colored string from pockets all over his coat. He put a red string round his left thumb and a green round his right. Then he purple, yellow, and pink round the first 3 fingers of his right hand, followed by black, blue, and white around the first 3 fingers of his left hand. Waif stood on the doorstep, frayed ears cocked, staring up the process with interest. Are we going to find the end of the rainbow or something? Charmaine asked. No, but this is how I've memorized the way to the kobolds, Peter explained. Right. Shut the front door and let's go. Shouted the bag. And shame on you, Peter said, leading the way to the inner door. Waif trotted after, and Charmaine followed with the writhing bag. They turned right through the door. Charmaine was too preoccupied to say she thought that was the way to the conference room. That is a very weirdly phrased sentence. Oh, Charmaine was too preoccupied to say she thought that was the way to the conference room. She was remembering how easily all the kobolds had vanished and reappeared, and how Rollo himself had sunk into the earth of the mountain meadow. It seemed you're entirely too early, dear. It's not quite ready. It seemed to her that it was only a matter of time before Rollo sank out of the bottom of the embroidered bag. She kept one hand underneath it, but she was sure that was not enough. With milk dripping between her fingers, she tried to keep Rollo in with a spell. The trouble was, she had no idea how you did this. The only thing she could think of was to use the way that she had dealt with Peter's leaking pipe spells. Stay inside, she thought at Rollo, massaging the bottom of the bag. Each massaging produced another muffled yell from the bag, which made her surer than ever that Rollo was getting away. So she simply followed Peter as he turned this way or that, and never noticed how you got to the kobolds at all. She only noticed when they were there. They were standing outside a large, well-lit cave full of little blue people rushing about. It was hard to see what most of them were doing, because the view was partly blocked by a very strange object in the entrance. This object looked a little like one of the horse-drawn sleds that people used in High Norland when the winter snows came down and made it impossible to use a cart or a carriage, except that this thing had no way to hitch a horse to it. It had a huge curvy handle on the back instead. It had curls and curvy bits all over it. Dozens of kobolds were working at it, climbing this way and that over it as they worked. Some were lining the inside with padding and sheepskin, some were hammering and carving, and the rest were painting the outside with curly blue flowers on a gold background. I love you. You are the cutest recycling bin I have ever met, you dope. She's eating paper. Yeah, you think you're funny. I love you. It was going to be very magnificent when it was finished. Whatever it was. Peter said to Charmaine, "Can I trust you to be polite this time? Can you remember to be tactful at least?" "I can try," Charmaine said. "It depends." "Well, then let me do the talking," he told her. He tapped the nearest busy kobold on the back. Excuse me, can you tell me where I can find Timmins, please?"
"Halfway down the cave," the kobold piped, pointing with her paintbrush. "Working on the cuckoo clock. What do you want him for?"
"We've got something very important to tell him," Peter said. This attracted the attention of most of the kobolds working on the project. Some of them turned and looked apprehensively at Waif. Waif at once looked sprightly, demure, and lovable. 'Cause she's a good dog. That's my baby girl. She is a dope, and I love her. The rest stared at Charmaine and the writhing embroidered bag. "What have you got there?" one of them asked Charmaine. "Rollo," said Charmaine. Most of them nodded without seeming at all surprised. When Peter asked, "Is it all right to go and speak to Timmins?" they all nodded again and told him, "Go ahead." Charmaine got the feeling that nobody liked Rollo very much. Rollo seemed to know this, because he stopped writhing and made no kind of noise while Peter edged his way past the strange object and Charmaine came after him, holding the bag sideways so as not to get paint on it. "What are you making?" she asked the nearest kobolds as she went.
"Commission from the elves,"
one of them answered. Another added, "Going to cost a lot." And the third said,
"Elves pay really well."
Charmaine came out into the cave feeling none the wiser. The place was huge, and there were tiny kobold children tearing about among the busy adults. Most of the children screamed and ran away when they saw Waif. Their parents mostly moved prudently round to the back of whatever they were working on and went on painting, polishing, or carving. Peter led the way past rocking horses, doll houses, baby chairs, grandfather clocks, wooden settles, and wind-up wooden dolls until they came to the cuckoo clock. It was unmistakable. It was enormous. Its giant wooden casing stretched all the way up to the magically lighted roof. Its huge clock face was propped up separately, filling most of the wall beside the casing, and the cuckoo for it, which a score of kobolds were diligently covering with feathers, was rather larger than Charmaine and Peter together. Charmaine wondered whoever might want a cuckoo clock that big. Timmins was climbing about in the massive clockwork with a tiny spanner. "There he is," Peter said, recognizing him by his nose. Peter went up to the giant works and cleared his throat. Excuse me. Excuse us." Timmins swung himself round a mighty coil of metal and glowered at them. "Oh, it's you," he eyed the bag. kidnapping people now, are you? Rollo must have heard Timmins' voice and felt he was among friends. The bag bellowed. That's Rollo, Timmins said accusingly. That's right, Peter said. We've brought him here to confess to you. The Lubbock on the mountain paid him to make trouble between you and Wizard Norland. The bag shouted, but Timmins had gone silvery blue with horror. The Lubbock? He said. That's right, said Peter. We saw him yesterday asking the Lubbock for his reward, and the Lubbock gave him a crock of gold from the end of the rainbow. Denied the bag loudly. Both of us saw it, Peter said. Let him out, Timmins said. Let him speak. Peter nodded at Charmaine. She took her hand away from the bottom of the bag and stopped doing what she hoped was her spell. And Rollo instantly fell through onto the floor, where he sat, spitting out milky ends of embroidery wool and old crumbs and glaring at Peter. I really did some magic. I kept him in there, Charmaine thought. You see what they're like? Rollo said angrily. Bag a person up, fill his mouth with stale fuzz so that he can't answer back while they tell lies about him. You can answer now, Timmins said. Did you get a crock of gold from the Lubbock for setting us at odds with the wizard? How could I have done? Rollo asked virtuously. No kobold would be seen dead while talking to a Lubbock. Y'all know that. Quite a crowd of kobolds had gathered round by now, at a safe distance from Waif, and Rollo waved dramatic arms at them. Bear witness, he said. I'm victim of a pack of lies. Go and search his grotto, some of you, Timmins ordered. Several kobolds set off at once. Rollo jumped to his feet. I'll go with you, he cried out. I'll prove there's nothing there. Rollo had gone 3 steps when Waif seized him by the back of his blue jacket and bumped him onto the floor again. She stayed there, teeth in Rollo's jacket, frayed tail wagging, with one ear cocked towards Charmaine as if to say, Didn't I do well? You did wonderfully well, Charmaine told her. Good dog. Rollo shouted, Call it off, it's hurting my back. No, you can stay there until they come back from searching your grotto, Charmaine said. Rollo folded his arms and started looking righteous and sulky. Charmaine turned to Timmins. Is it all right to ask you who wants such a big clock while we wait? She explained, seeing Peter shaking his head at her. Timmins looked up at the vast pieces of clock. Crown Prince Ludovic, he said, with a gloomy sort of pride. And a whopper for Castle Joy. Gloom swallowed up his pride. He hasn't paid us a penny yet. He never does pay. When you think about how rich he is. He was interrupted by the kobolds coming back at a run. Here it is, they shouted. Is this it? It was under his bed. The kobold in front was carrying the crock in both arms. It looked like an ordinary clay pottery crock, the kind someone might use to make stew in an oven, except that it had a sort of glow around it in faint rainbow colors. That's the one, Peter said. What did you think he did with the gold? The kobold asked. Papa, you're being very noisy. What do you mean, what did I do with the gold? Rollo demanded. That there pot was stuffed full. He stopped, realizing he was giving himself away. Well, it isn't now. Take a look if you don't believe me, the other kobold retorted. He dumped the crock down between Rollo's outstretched legs. It's just how we found it. Rollo bent to look inside of the pot. He uttered a cry of grief. He plunged his hand into it and brought up a handful of dry yellow leaves. Then he brought out another handful and another until he had both hands inside the empty crock and was sitting surrounded in dead leaves. It's gone, he howled. It's turned into dead leaves. That Lubbock cheated me. So you admit the Lubbock paid you to make trouble, Timmins said. Rollo scowled sideways at Timmins. I don't admit to anything except that I've been robbed. Peter coughed. I'm afraid that the Lubbock cheated him worse than that. It laid its eggs in him as soon as his back was turned. There were gasps from all around. Big-nosed kobold faces all stared at Rollo, pale blue with horror, noses and all, and then turned to Peter. It's true, we both saw it, Peter said. Charmaine nodded when they turned to her. True, she said. It's a lie, Rollo howled. You're pulling my leg. No, we're not, Charmaine said. The Lubbock stuck out his egg-laying prong and got you in the back just before you went down into the earth. Didn't you say just now that your back hurt you? Rollo's eyes popped at Charmaine. He believed her. His mouth opened. Waif scrambled hastily away as he began to scream. He threw the pot aside. He drummed his heels in a storm of dry leaves and yelled until his face was navy blue. "I'm a goner," he blubbered. "I'm walking dead. There's things reading inside of me. Help! Please help me, somebody!" But nobody helped him. All the kobolds backed away, still staring in horror. Peter looked disgusted. One lady kobold said,
"What a disgraceful display."
And this seemed so unfair to Charmaine that she could not help feeling very truly sorry for Rollo. "The elves can help him," she said to Timmins.
"What did you say?" "What did you say?"
Timmins snapped his fingers. There was sudden silence. Although Rollo continued to drum his heels and open and shut his mouth, nobody could hear the noise. "What did you say?" Timmins said to Charmaine. "The elves," Charmaine said. "They know how to get Lubbock eggs out of a person." "Yes, they do," Peter agreed. "Wizard Norland had Lubbock eggs laid in him. That's why they took him away to cure him. An elf came yesterday with the eggs they'd taken out of him." "Elves charge high," remarked a kobold by Charmaine's right knee, sounding very impressed. "I think the king paid," Charmaine said. "Shh!" Timmins' brow was wrinkled right down to his nose. He sighed. "I suppose," he said, "we can give the elves their sled chair for nothing in exchange for them curing Rollo." "Curses! That's 2 commissions we won't get paid for now. Put Rollo to bed, some of you, and I'll talk to the elves. And I warn all of you again not to go near that meadow." "Oh, it's all right now," Peter said cheerfully. "The Lubbock's dead. The fire demon killed it." "The what?" shrieked all of the other kobolds. "Dead?" they clamored. "Really? You mean the fire demon that's visiting the king? He actually killed it?" "Yeah, really," Peter shouted through the noise. "He killed the Lubbock and then he destroyed the eggs that the elf brought." "We think he destroyed himself, too," Charmaine added. She was fairly sure none of the kobolds heard her. They were all too busy dancing, cheering, and throwing their small blue hats into the air. When the noise had died down a little and 4 sturdy kobolds had carried Rollo away, still soundlessly kicking and screaming, Timmins said seriously to Peter, "That Lubbock kept us all in fear, in being the parent of the crown prince and all. What can we give the fire demon to show our gratitude, do you think?" "I'll put the Wizard Norland's kitchen taps back," Peter said promptly. "Well, that goes without saying. It was Rollo's doing they were taken away. I meant, what can mere kobolds do for a fire demon that it can't do for itself?" "I know," Charmaine said. Everyone was respectfully quiet as she went on. "Calcifer and his family were trying to find out where all the king's money keeps disappearing to. Can you help them do that?" There were murmurs from all around Charmaine's knees of, "Oh, easy that is," and "That's no problem," and quite a ripple of laughter, as if Charmaine had asked a stupid question. Timmins was so relieved that his brow unwrinkled entirely, making his nose and his whole face twice as long. "That is easy to do," he said, "and costs nothing." He glanced across to the other side of the cave, where at least 60 cuckoo clocks hung, all wagging their pendulums in 60 different rhythms. "If you come with me now, I think we should be just in time to see the money going. Are you sure the fire demon would be pleased by this?" "Oh, absolutely," Charmaine said. "Well then, follow me, please," Timmins said. He led the way towards the back of the cave. Wherever they were going to turned out to be quite a long walk. Charmaine became as confused as she had been on her way to the kobold's cave. They were in half dark the whole distance, and the route seemed to be all bends and sharp turns and hairpin corners. Every so often, Timmins would say, 3 short steps and turn right, or count 8 human-sized steps and turn left, then turn sharp right and left again. And this went on for so long that Waif became tired out and whined to be picked up. Charmaine carried her for what seemed to be more than half the way. "I must explain that the kobolds here belong to a different clan," Timmins said, when at last there seemed to be a little daylight ahead. "I like to think that my clan would have managed better than they do." Then, before Charmaine could ask what he meant, he went into a flurry of sharp rights and slow lefts. With a couple of zigzags thrown in, and she found that they were at the end of an underground passage in cool green daylight. Marble steps, all greened over with mildew, led up into some of the bushes. The bushes must once have been planted on either side of the steps, but they had all grown to fill the space entirely. Waif began to growl, sounding like a dog twice her size. "Shh," Timmins whispered. "No noise at all from here onward." Waif stopped growling at once, but Charmaine could feel her small, hot body throbbing with hidden growls. Grr. Charmaine turned to Peter to make sure he had the sense to keep quiet too, but Peter was not there. There was only herself, Waif, and Timmins. Charmaine, wholly exasperated, knew just what had happened. Somewhere along the confusing way, when Timmins had said to turn left, Peter had turned right, or the other way around. Charmaine had no idea at what point this had happened, but she knew it had. Never mind, she thought. He has enough colored string around his fingers to find He has enough colored string around his fingers to find his way to Ingrid and back. He'll probably arrive at Great Uncle William's house long before I do. So she forgot about Peter and concentrated on tiptoeing the slippery, mildewed steps, and then on peering out from among the bushes, without rustling so much as one leaf. There was a blazing sunlight beyond, blazing on, very green, very beautifully kept grass, with a blindingly white garden path beyond that. The path led up between trees that had been carved into knobs and points and cones and discs, like a lesson in geometry, to a small storybook palace, one that had many small pointed towers with little blue roofs. Charmaine recognized it at Castle Joy, where Crown Prince Ludovic lived. She was slightly ashamed to realize that it was the building that she had always thought of when any book she was reading mentioned a palace. It must be very unimaginative, she thought. Then, no. Whenever her father made shortbreads to sell in boxes for May Day, a picture of Castle Joy always appeared on the top of the box. Castle Joy was, after all, the pride of High Norland. No wonder it was so far to walk, she thought. We must be halfway down High Norland Valley here, and it still is my idea of a perfect palace. So there! Footsteps crunched on the hot white path, and Prince Ludovic himself appeared, magnificent in white and azure silk, sauntering towards the palace. Just before he was level with the bush where Charmaine was, he stopped and turned. "Come along, can't you?" he said angrily. "Gotta move on."
"We're trying, Highness,"
piped a small, panting voice. A line of kobolds trudged into view, each bowed down under a Navi leather sack. They were all more grayish-green than blue and looked most unhappy. Some of the unhappiness may have been due to the sunlight, for kobolds preferred to live in the dark, but Charmaine thought that their color looked more like bad health. Their legs wobbled, one or two of them were coughing badly. The last one in the row was so unwell that he stumbled and fell down, dropping his sack, which spilled a scatter of gold coins across the blazing white path. At this, the colorless gentleman strode into view. He advanced on the fallen kobold and started kicking him. He did not kick particularly hard, nor did he look particularly cruel. It was more as if he was trying to get a machine going again. The kobold scrambled about under the kicks, desperately picking up gold coins until he had them all back in the sack and managed to stagger to his feet again. The colorless gentleman left off kicking him and came to stroll beside Prince Ludovic. It's not as if it was even a heavy load," he said to the prince. "It's probably the last. They've no more money left unless the king sells his books." Prince Ludovic laughed. "He'd rather die than do that, which suits me, of course. We'll have to think of some other way to get our money then. Castle Joy is so dashed expensive to run." He looked back at the trudging, wobbling kobolds. "Move along there, will you? I have to get back to the royal mansion for tea." The colorless gentleman nodded and strode back to the kobolds, ready to start kicking again. The prince waited for him, saying, "Mind you, if I ever see another crumpet in my life, it will be too soon for me." The kobolds saw the colorless gentleman coming and did their best to hurry. All the same, it seemed an age to Charmaine until the procession was out of sight, and she could no longer hear their footsteps crunching. She kept her arms tight around the throbbing waif, who seemed to want to jump down and chase the procession, and looked down through the leaves at Timmins. "Why haven't you told anyone about this before? Why didn't you at least tell Wizard Norland?" "Nobody asked," Timmins said, looking injured. No, of course nobody asked, Charmaine thought. This was why Rollo had paid to make the kobolds angry with Great Uncle William. He'd have got round to asking them in the end if he hadn't been ill. She thought it was just as well that the Lubbock was dead. If it was Prince Ludovic's parent, as Timmins had said, then it had probably meant to kill the crown prince and rule the country instead of him. It had more or less told her so after all, but that still leaves Prince Ludovic to deal with, she thought. Really have to tell the king about him. Seems a bit hard on those kobolds, she said to Timmins. It is, Timmins agreed, but they've not asked for help yet. And of course it never occurred to you to help them without being asked, did it? Charmaine thought. Honestly, I give up. Can you show me the way home? She asked. Timmins hesitated. Do you think the fire demon will be glad to know the money goes to Castle Joy? He asked. Yes. Or his family will. And with that, O best beloved, it is time for you to get some sleep. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate without knowing a thing about you, then I can love you for exactly the same reason. So, sleep well, dear. And we have, or rather, I have 7 more pages of Coraline before I can start reading it to all of you. So, sleep well, dearest.